Everybody. Hello and welcome to our panel today. My name is Jane Thrailkill and I'm with the Department of English and Comparative Literature. I will serve as the moderator today. Our panel is entitled, "What Should I Know About Abortion?" Recognizing that there are many large gaps in knowledge about abortion, our panelists are here to share knowledge, provide evidence-based information, and answer your questions. The event is being sponsored by UNC's Department of Public Policy, the Department of Social Medicine, and the Department of Maternal and Child Health. Our speakers will introduce themselves. I should let you know that each speaker will speak for roughly 5 to 6 minutes. Once we are all done, we will then entertain questions. You are welcome to put your questions into the chat at any point. This is a multidisciplinary group. We have a political scientist, a sociologist, an ethicist, a physician, a public health scholar, and a psychologist. So my role as moderator is to convey audience questions to our panelists. And I also should let you know that there is closed captioning available. So you may set your closed caption on your own Zoom computer accordingly. So without further ado, let us get going with our panelists.
Hi, everyone. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for attending this panel on what should I know about abortion. If you are an undergraduate student who would like to receive continuing life experience credit, and I assume you know what that means, then I encourage you to take a moment here to quickly scan the QR code to get credit for that. So I'm just going to leave that up for about 5 more seconds. All right. Okay, so I would like to start by introducing myself. My name is Rebecca Kreitzer, and I'm a political scientist, and I work in the Department of Public Policy. I'm excited to be part of this panel today that's bringing together a series of experts to shed light on what we know from our varied expertise and perspectives about abortion. As a political scientist, I've studied many different things that have to do with the politics and legality of abortion, as well as how the mass public thinks about abortion. And I'm going to share just a little bit of that today. Before I get into kind of my section of this talk, I want to give you a brief introduction to the panel overall and why we're holding this panel. This is a figure that's showing the number of abortion restrictions that have been enacted since 1973. And what you can see is that there have been more restrictions enacted in like the last decade or so than in the preceding 4 decades. And in particular, there's been a big increase since the early 90s, and especially the last few years. So it's important to talk about what are the implications of having restrictions on abortion. Reproductive rights, as you'll hear from my colleagues today, are essential for women's socioeconomic well-being and overall health. And very broadly, just to foreshadow what you'll learn about throughout this panel, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that having control over first entry into parenthood leads to things like greater relationship stability and satisfaction. Having control over the timing and number of children shapes housing and food insecurity, as well as reliance on Medicaid and other state programs. It also shapes work experience and opportunities. And so therefore, it affects your long-term wages and average career earnings. And it also shapes both physical and mental health in various ways. In just this year, we've seen that abortion policy has started to really change. And in particular, state policies have started to polarize. By polarize, I mean that some states have become more restrictive of abortion and other states have become more protective of abortion. So what are the implications for reproductive rights varying so much across the US? 130 days ago, the Supreme Court issued a decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Hole Women's Health. And 130 days ago, it was unconstitutional to restrict abortion before the point of viability, which was around 24 weeks or so. Today, more than a third of Americans live in a state where abortion is banned, which you can see in this figure here. In fact, there's a great swath of the country that is red, where abortion is entirely prohibited. You can see places like Georgia, which is yellow, have a limit at 6 weeks. And our neighbor to the south, South Carolina, currently has a policy that is blocked by, and it is going through legal challenges. What you can see is that, that as abortion has become unavailable in some places, it has led to access and abortion changing, even in states where policy hasn't changed all that much. So a number of the people who are from southern states where abortion has become entirely prohibited have found their way to other states, including North Carolina, where there's been a pretty significant increase percentage-wise in the number of abortions. But not everybody is able to make that travel, take time off from work, get through the logistics, and manage to travel across the country. I want to start by talking about kind of how we got here. And so I'm going to cover very quickly about 250 years of legal history. I want to start by saying that contraception and abortion were pretty common in early US history, especially abortion up until the point of was called at the time quickening. And quickening can happen anywhere between 15 and 20 weeks, depending on if it's your first child and your own individual body. It just varies sometimes. And over to the side, you can see an image, and this image is actually a recipe that Ben Franklin wrote to treat the malady of suppressed courses. By suppressed courses, they meant menstruation, and when your menstruation was blocked, it was because you were pregnant. What is interesting about this is that you can see that Ben Franklin was quite explicit, and it wasn't controversial per se to share this information. In fact, it was in a very widely distributed book. But what you'll also see is that it doesn't say contraception or abortion anywhere in there. So when you're looking for abortion and contraception in American history, it's important to know that language changes over time. By the mid-1800s, there was a push in the US by a subset of doctors to restrict abortion. I say a subset of doctors because while they were speaking on behalf of the American Medical Association, the AMA was quite new at the time, and their evidence suggests that the policy changes were really driven by a small group. In doing this, the AMA and physicians were trying to raise the stature of this new emerging discipline and expertise of obstetrics and gynecology. And one of the ways they did that was by discrediting midwives and the women who were central to reproductive health at the time. At the time, there were also racist fears of declining white fertility, especially as waves of immigrants came in from especially Asia at the time, which spurred a movement to try to restrict access to abortion. By the 1870s, the US had a federal law as well as state laws that made it illegal to sell, lend, give away any quote unquote obscene material that could be used for contraception or abortion. So even just providing information about family planning was heavily restricted. There were a number of challenges to this, but it was not until 1965 in the Supreme Court case of Griswold versus Connecticut, which established the right for married couples, only heterosexual people could be married at the time, to obtain contraception. The Supreme Court issued a quite interesting decision that has broad implications for how we think about rights today. The decision said that privacy is implied by what's called a penumbra of rights. A penumbra means by association. And it said that in particular, when you look at a bunch of the bills in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, they seem to indicate that there was a right to privacy. The First Amendment, for example, says that we should have the right to right to free speech and the right to petition our government and hold assemblies, as well as the right to not have religion established by the government and the right to practice our own. The Third Amendment says that we can't be forced to allow soldiers to quarter in our homes in times of peace. The Fourth Amendment gets into unreasonable search and seizure and the expectation that we have privacy in our own homes. And the Ninth Amendment really critically says that our rights are not limited to those rights that have already been written down, and that there are additional rights that are not written, but that are still protected by the US Constitution. The Supreme Court then reasoned and declared that there was a right to marital privacy that's protected by the Constitution. This ends up shaping a whole bunch of other Supreme Court cases. So other cases that also build upon the idea of there being a right to privacy or build upon Griswold in other ways include things like Loving versus Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage, the right to contraception for non-married people, the right to gay sex, the right to same-sex marriage. And the last one on my list here actually predates Griswold, but it's deeply connected, and it's the right to not be sterilized without our consent. There's a number of Supreme Court cases that have to do with abortion in the ensuing years, but I just want to briefly tell you about three of them. The first one, and probably the one that you know the most about, is Roe versus Wade. And Roe established that abortion was part of these fundamental constellation of privacy rights that I just mentioned. It said, in fact, that was the essential holding. The most important part of Roe was that there was a fundamental right to abortion. It also went on to say that abortion could be restricted based off of a trimester framework. One thing that I think is really interesting is that the trimester framework wasn't mentioned by any of the doctors or legal counsel that argued before the Supreme Court. Instead, it was something that one of the clerks who worked for a Supreme Court justice came up with on their own. It says that in the first trimester of pregnancy, that abortion should be allowed and mostly free from state constraints. In the second trimester, it said that restrictions could be permissible only when necessary to protect the women's health. In the third, it said that states could restrict or could invoke an interest in protecting the life of the fetus and could restrict abortion entirely. So in other words, in the first trimester, abortion would be largely legal. In the last trimester, states could make it mostly illegal. And in the middle, restrictions would only be allowed when it was necessary to protect the health. The next important case you need to know about comes from 1992, and it's the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. In this case, they rejected the trimester framework, and instead they talked about and they set the threshold for when to allow restrictions on abortion as being viability. But viability is a very fuzzy term, and it's opened the door to a lot of debate about what viability means. I want to show you just briefly this figure. This is a figure from the Washington Post using data from the Journal of Pediatrics. And what it shows is changes in the survival rate of infants born at 22 weeks, which is around viability. We often think of viability as being around 24 weeks, though it really varies at the individual level by pregnancy. What you can see is just between 2007 and 2019, the rate at which infants survived at 22 weeks increased quite a bit by about 10 percentage points. But the active treatment rate is much higher. So when people talk about viability, what does viability mean? Does viability mean the first time that any infant is able to survive outside of the womb? Is it when the average infant is able to live at the earliest gestation point? Is it the earliest that an infant can live with extensive medical intervention and high cost and disability? It's really not clear. The Supreme Court also established that there couldn't be an undue burden, which they not very helpfully defined as a substantial obstacle. These are also both very unclear. And in recent years, there was more discussion, especially in the Supreme Court among some of the litigants, arguing that there could in fact be a cumulative substantial burden when there are multiple restrictions all at once. The reason why we're here today has to do with the third case I'll briefly mention, which is Dobbs versus Jackson Whole Women's Health. In this case, it overturned Roe versus Wade and said that abortion is not a fundamental right. It also allowed broad discretion to states to adopt restrictions on abortion. I want to briefly cover some of the political history, but really you'll notice that the political history is much shorter than the legal history. For the first time, political parties set distinctive party platforms on abortion in 1984. And partisans quickly adopted the views of their parties. By 1989, 80% of Democrats were supportive of abortion rights and 80% of Republicans were opposed to abortion rights. Contraception had broad bipartisan support, especially until the early 2000s. In fact, I often think about the big champion of contraception policy being President Nixon, who established the program for Title X. Today, abortion is increasingly conflated. Contraception is increasingly conflated with abortion, sometimes intentionally, but I think sometimes people are just not aware of what certain terms and words mean. Today, abortion is very much central to the political landscape. When we think about people being single issue voters, abortion is the primary issue that falls into that classification. Abortion is also often used as a litmus test for a major political office, including for sitting on the Supreme Court. There's a lot of money that is in campaign contributions and powerful interest groups on both sides that shape elections. There's also significant social movement mobilization, and there's evidence that having abortion on the ballot can shape turnout. And also, it just undergirds a whole lot of things that are seemingly completely unrelated to abortion, but somehow the politics of abortion can get intertwined with that. Very briefly, I want to comment on public opinion. Public opinion on abortion is especially murky, in part because the issue is very complicated and people don't really know very much about the issue. And so small changes in question wording can really change how people answer. The first slide I want to show you is showing support for abortion for a couple of different reasons why people might get an abortion. What you can see is that there's a lot of support, especially for when there's a severe fetal defect, or in the case of rape, or when women's health is endangered. But that's actually the minority of people who seek abortions are for those reasons. We can also see that there's been a quite substantial shift in public opinion in the last 20 years or so, where before support for abortion for all these other reasons hovered around 40%, but today it's closer to 50%. I mentioned earlier that that political parties didn't have distinctive positions on abortion until the 1990s, and you can see that quite clearly in these figures, where abortion public opinion has polarized by political parties, with Democrats becoming more supportive over time and Republicans becoming less supportive over time. A lot of times people refer to themselves using terms like pro-life and pro-choice, but these are terms that I tend to personally stray away from. And the reason why is that these terms can be quite confusing and people have different understandings of what they mean. For example, some people who say that they're pro-life say things like, I'm pro-life, but I support abortion rights for other people. And other people would say that's what pro-choice means. Nevertheless, despite the kind of murkiness and complicated nature of public opinion, we can see real shifts over time, especially an increase in recent years, even among Republicans who are discontent with current abortion policy and want laws to be less strict by party. I want to end by asking a question. I just showed you what public opinion is about abortion, but now I want to ask you, should public opinion really shape medicine? Most people, including this is from my own research, don't know the laws in their own states. So when you ask people if abortion access should be easier or harder to get, I'm not sure how useful that question is when people themselves don't really know the process until they find themselves in the situation where they need to navigate that. There's also a lot of misconceptions about abortion and who seeks abortion care. And the research indicates that people's expressed opinions about abortion shift when misconceptions are corrected. That's one of the reasons why I'm very excited to be part of this panel where people are providing information. This is particularly important because there's been a long history of stigmatized conversations when it comes to things like abortion, pregnancy loss. And I can say that even in my own family, I heard from my brother's wives that my mom had had several miscarriages. And I think that that's quite common. It's not unheard of to hear people not even realize that they themselves had gotten an abortion. In recent months, you may have seen the news story about Chrissy Teigen. 2 years ago, when she had a miscarriage, I would say many people around the world grieved with her. And it was only recently when she realized that in the course of her treatment for a miscarriage, she had an abortion. I'd also add that other medical procedures are not tightly regulated by legislators and the general public who don't have medical training. And medicine is extraordinarily complicated. And I really question, and I encourage you to kind of open your mind and think anew about, to what degree can the mass public and lawmakers ever be knowledgeable enough to regulate abortion in a way that anticipates the complexity of who would need an abortion and why. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Amy Bryant, who can tell us more about that.
Hello, everyone. Hi, good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Dr. Amy Bryant. I'm an associate professor in the Department of OBGYN at the School of Medicine here at UNC, and I'm also a complex family planning specialist. So I thought what we should do here tonight is actually, oh, next slide, please, is actually to start with the basics to really make sure that we're all on the same page. So my first question here is, what is a pregnancy? So here we have a female reproductive tract with an ovum or an egg that's been released from the ovary. And I don't think we need to go into how the sperm get into the reproductive tract, but once they're in there, if an egg has been released from the ovary, then the egg or the ovum, the egg, or also called the ovum, can be fertilized by the sperm. So this creates a fertilized egg or a zygote, which then begins to cleave or to divide over the next several days as it travels through the fallopian tube, dividing into more and more cells until it becomes a blastocyst, the structure that then implants on the uterine wall and grows into a pregnancy. Now, as many as a third to a half of fertilized eggs will never implant. That's just part of the natural process. But the process of going from a fertilized egg to an implanted blastocyst takes somewhere around 8 to 9 days, and that's what we consider that that's when we consider that a pregnancy's been established. And it's really just a few days after implantation that a urine pregnancy test can be positive. Next slide, please. So from there, the pregnancy continues to grow. First going through the embryonic period when the pregnancy begins to form organs, limbs, placenta, and then this embryo is termed a fetus beginning in the 11th week of pregnancy, which is the 9th week of development after fertilization of the egg. So pregnancies, as you all may know, are dated using the last menstrual period, which means that the weeks of pregnancy by convention is 2 weeks more than the weeks of development. So a pregnancy that is 3 weeks, has been developing for 3 weeks, is what we would call a pregnancy of 5 weeks, by a 5-week pregnancy by last menstrual period. Next slide, please. So and as Dr. Kreitzer mentioned, we can also look at pregnancies using trimesters. So the first trimester is the first 3 months, so through about 13 weeks of pregnancy. The second trimester is about 14 to 27 weeks of pregnancy. And then the third trimester is 28 to 40 weeks. And again, this is, in medical terms, we use weeks of pregnancy. Many people are familiar with the months of pregnancy, and that's what's shown here. A person can have a positive pregnancy test as early as 4 weeks, or even before the first month of pregnancy after their last menstrual period. People usually get an ultrasound around 18 to 20 weeks, and that's the point at which specialists will look for abnormalities that could affect the fetus, as well as be able to tell the sex of the fetus. And then, as Dr. Kreitzer mentioned, viability is what we consider the time a fetus could reasonably survive on its own outside the uterus. And that's usually thought to be about 24 weeks for a healthy fetus. So next slide, please. So now that we're on the same page about abortion, about pregnancy, what is an abortion? Next slide, please. So an abortion, the definition of abortion is the removal or interruption of an embryo or a fetus before the stage of viability. And as we mentioned, viability is somewhere around 24 weeks, though that can actually vary if the fetus, for example, has a condition that's incompatible with life. So a fetus that is has failed to develop a brain or failed to develop kidneys or something, some vital organ may not ever be considered compatible with life. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to note also that this definition takes several different forms in a medical sense. So abortion is really a technical term. It can refer to all different kinds of abortion. So a missed abortion is a kind of abortion that where the pregnancy stops growing inside the uterus and but hasn't yet come out of the uterus. Inevitable or incomplete abortion might be when there's a lot of cramping and bleeding, but the pregnancy still hasn't come out of the uterus. And these are what we call spontaneous abortions, or as it's known colloquially, miscarriage. A septic abortion is a very bad infection of the pregnancy that can be very dangerous for the pregnant person and also can't lead to a normal, healthy pregnancy. And an induced abortion is a removal of a pregnancy for what might be, in some cases, considered non-medical reasons or not because of the health of the pregnancy. Next slide, please. But when we say the word abortion in lay terms, most people are really thinking about this, not really thinking about the medical definition, but really focusing on pregnancies that are removed for what may be other indications for the pregnant person's life circumstances, their health conditions, or for fetal abnormalities. And some other words that you may have heard used for this would be termination, just plain abortion, induced abortion, therapeutic abortion, or interruption of pregnancy. Next slide, please. But I think it's really important to note that no matter the reason a pregnancy needs to be removed from a uterus, the methods for removal are the same. Next slide, please. So, so what are those methods? Basically, like much in medicine, we can break down treatment into two categories, either medical management or surgical management. So for medical management, we use two different kinds of medication to remove a pregnancy. And these are the same medications that can be used in both the first and the second trimester. And they can be used no matter what the indication or the reason for the procedure is, whether it's because the fetus has already demised or whether there's some other reason for the abortion to occur. Mifepristone is also known as the abortion pill, and it acts by blocking the hormones of the pregnancy and getting the uterus ready to accept the second type of medicine that we give people to help to expel the pregnancy from the uterus. Misoprostol is a medicine that causes uterine cramping and bleeding, and this is what we give to really help the uterus empty out, contract, and expel the pregnancy. In the first trimester, this combination of medications can be used at home because it's very safe, and there's a very long safety record that that people can safely manage an induced abortion or a miscarriage management at home in the first trimester. In the second trimester, these procedures should really be done in the hospital because there's more risk of complication or bleeding, really, and other problems that can occur. So it's better to have this done in the hospital. But it can also be safely done in the hospital. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to take a very quick detour here to say something about Plan B, because there are also often some misconceptions about how Plan B works. So next slide. Plan B is a form of emergency contraception that delays ovulation. So if you remember back to those first slides, it prevents the egg from being in the fallopian tube in the first place to get fertilized. So if it doesn't manage to do that and ovulation does occur, it may impact the ability of a fertilized egg to implant, but since it can change the lining of the uterus, but that's not the main mechanism of action. And in fact, if it were part of the mechanism of action, it would probably be much more effective than it is. And then it's also just important to note that Plan B can't disrupt a pregnancy that's already implanted. So just to clarify, medical abortion is not the same as Plan B, and Plan B is not an abortion pill. Next slide, please. So surgical methods of abortion. Surgical methods of abortion use instruments and suction to physically remove the pregnancy from the uterus. So in the first trimester, this can be done with an instrument called a manual vacuum aspirator or with an electric vacuum aspirator. There are two different types of instruments that can be that create suction, that will suction out a pregnancy from the uterus. And this procedure is colloquially known as a D&C. In the second trimester, with the pregnancy farther along, the cervix needs to be dilated more beforehand with medication or dilators to help open up the cervix. So then instruments and suction are used to remove the pregnancy at that point. And that is known as a dilation and evacuation, or a D&E procedure. So what does this look like? This is a side view of a speculum in a vagina, and with a suction cannula inside of the uterus suctioning out an early pregnancy. So this just gives you an idea of what an abortion looks like. And to give you even more of a picture of what a pregnancy looks like at these early stages, these are some pregnancies from smallest to largest that are the smallest little one there that's just a few millimeters is about 5 weeks. And the largest that's a few centimeters is about 9 weeks. And as you can see, they just progress and get slightly bigger each week of pregnancy. Next slide, please. And so this graphic shows the breakdown of abortions done by gestational age. As you can see, the vast majority of abortions are done in the US in the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. And only about 1% are done over 20 weeks, and about 10% in that higher 15 to 20% range. And next slide, please. And finally, just to end, I'd like to note a little bit about abortion safety. So putting abortion into perspective, it is much safer than other procedures that are done regularly. So terminating a pregnancy at less than 9 weeks, there's a chance of death of less than 1 in 100,000. Now compare that to giving birth, where it's about 14 out of 100,000 women giving birth will die in childbirth. Compare that to driving an automobile, which it's about 16 in 100,000 who will die in the course of a year. And compared with some other common medical procedures, so liposuction and colonoscopy have a much higher chance of death than having a first trimester abortion. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to your questions in a bit.
Okay, thanks very much, Amy. I hope everyone can see my screen all right. So I'm Dr. Sian Curtis, and I'm a professor in the Department of Maternal and Child Health in the Gilling School of Global Public Health. And I'm going to talk about abortion from a public health perspective. Now, broadly speaking, public health is about protecting and improving the health of people and communities. Public health looks at health from a population perspective, different from the individual medical perspective we were just hearing about from Amy. And it looks at things like how common different health issues are in a population, what factors are associated with different health issues, and the effects of policies and programs on health behaviors and outcomes. Okay. All right, so next slide. Okay. So in this section of the panel, I'm going to address a few broad questions using data from large-scale population-based scientific studies. So this is the data session. And specifically, I'm going to explore the following questions. How common is abortion? Are abortions increasing or decreasing in the US? Who has abortions? Why do people have abortions? And what are the health consequences of restricting legal access to abortion? Okay. So So this first slide addresses the first two questions. How common is abortion, and is it increasing or decreasing? So what we see here are trends in the abortion rate from 1973 to 2017. The abortion rate is the number of abortions per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44 in the US. You can see that the abortion rate increased from 1973 to 1981, but has since been declining. By 2017, the abortion rate had declined to 13.5 abortions per 1,000 women of reproductive age, or age 15 to 44. However, the most recent data shows that the long-term downward trend in abortion reversed in 2020. So the abortion rate in 2020 was estimated to be 14.4 abortions per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44, and about 1 in 5 pregnancies were estimated to end in abortion. We're not sure yet exactly why abortion seems to have increased in 2020, but possible explanations include the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been associated with declines in birth and challenges in accessing health services. But this is an ongoing area of research. So here we see some characteristics of abortion patients from data collected in 2016, so a little earlier than some of the trend data we just looked at. But things haven't changed all that much since then. So about 75% of abortions live below the poverty line or have low incomes. About 39% of abortion patients are white, compared to 28% of who are Black, 25% who are Hispanic, and 6% who are Asian Pacific Islander. This means that abortion is relatively more common in low-income and Black and Hispanic populations, because they're overrepresented among abortion patients compared to the general population. 62% of abortion patients are religiously affiliated, and 59% already have a child. So some people think that people who have abortions are either not religious or don't have any children, and that's actually not the case. And the majority of abortion patients are in their 20s. They're not typically teenagers. Only about 12% of teens, and only about 4% of are minors. So now we're going to look a little bit about why women seek abortions. And these data come from the Turnaway study, which you'll hear about more in the next presentation. And this study, so it's not completely all abortion patients, it's specific groups of abortion patients that were recruited for who were seeking abortions in their first and second trimesters. Most women in the study reported multiple reasons for seeking an abortion. So typically it's not one single thing that drives the decision, but a complex weighing of a lot of different reasons. The most common reasons cited were that the abortion patient, the woman, did not feel they were financially prepared to care for a child. That was the top reason. About 40% of patients reported that. Second was that it was not the right time for them to have a child, followed by partner-related reasons, which could include things like they don't want to have a child with this particular partner, with a man involved in the pregnancy, or because of violence concerns or concerns that the partner would not be supportive in supporting a child. And then the fourth reason is they need to focus on other children that they already have. It is one thing to note that this study excluded women seeking abortions due to medical complications of the pregnancy as part of the criteria, so that's not reflected here, but it's a relatively small proportion of all abortions. About 13% of abortion patients reported problems with the fetus in a separate study done in 2005. Okay, so here we see trends in the number of abortion-related deaths from 1965 until 1997. So the number of abortion-related deaths dropped rapidly from about 1970. This decline coincided with liberalization of abortion laws in many states and with the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973 that legalized abortion nationally. This does not necessarily mean that we will see a rise in abortion-related mortality to pre-Roe levels now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned. We don't see that in Latin America, for example, where abortion is often highly restricted, but where there is widespread use of self-managed medical abortion that's relatively safe, as we just heard from Amy. But it illustrates that illegal abortion is markedly less safe than legal abortion. And we also see that in other contemporary international comparisons, comparing abortion mortality in countries and states with liberal versus less liberal laws. Okay. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the health consequences of being denied an abortion, also coming from the Turnaway study. So we know that women who are denied a wanted abortion are more likely than those who received an abortion to experience life-threatening complications associated with continuing the pregnancy to term. And that's because pregnancy is less safe than having an abortion, as we heard from Amy. They're also more likely to report being in overall poorer physical health several years after the pregnancy than women who received an abortion. They're also more likely to experience certain types of chronic pain, such as headaches, and to experience gestational hypertension, which is associated either with the pregnancy that they were seeking an abortion or subsequent pregnancies. However, there are no differences in other health outcomes examined, such as asthma, non-gestational hypertension, diabetes, or chronic pelvic, back, or abdominal pain. So, to sum up, going back to our original questions, abortion is a relatively common procedure. About 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 women will have an abortion over the course of their lifetime. Abortion rates have been declining in the US, but they have increased slightly in 2020. Low-income women and Black and Hispanic women are more likely to have abortions than white women. Many women who have abortions are religiously affiliated and already have children. Lack of financial resources are a major reason for wanting to have an abortion, and restricted access to abortion is associated with several negative health outcomes for people seeking abortions. Okay, and with that, I will pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks to our prior panelists for those great presentations. My name is Dr. Keely Muscatel. I'm an associate professor here at UNC in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, and I'm here to tell you what I think you should know about the psychological impacts of abortion. So it's my hope that the knowledge that you'll gain by the end of my short presentation here are kind of 4 main points. First, how does abortion impact mental health? Second, how does abortion impact economic outcomes? Third, how does abortion impact domestic violence experienced? And fourth and finally, how does abortion impact the lives of children? So to start off, how does abortion impact mental health? I want to preface my talk today to say that most of the data I'm going to be discussing with you come from a study called the Turnaway study. If you're interested in learning more about the Turnaway study, there was a book published by its principal investigator, Dr. Diana Green Foster, a couple of years ago. They also have a lot of information on the website that I have shown the link to below if you'd like to learn more. But just briefly to give you a sense for what this study was about, because it's what I'm going to primarily share data from. The Turnaway study was conducted or started between 2008 and 2010. The researchers partnered with 30 abortion facilities around the United States, across different states and different regions. And they enrolled 1,000 self-identified women, so all self-identified women in this study who were all seeking abortions. And they looked at 3 different groups of women who were seeking abortions. Those who were seeking abortion during their first trimester, those who were seeking abortion near their gestational limits in their particular state in which they were provided an abortion. So these are folks who are getting close to the point at which it would be illegal for them to have an abortion, but they're not quite there yet. And then a third group of individuals who were just past the gestational limits. So they were denied an abortion, even though they wanted one. So this is the group who was turned away from having an abortion, hence the turnaway study. So these researchers conducted interviews and surveys with the women who they enrolled in their study roughly every 6 months after they received or were denied an abortion for roughly 5 years following that experience. I'm going to tell you about some of the data that they collected and what they found. So first, what impact does abortion have on mental health of people who seek them? When you think about what comes to mind when we think about the potential mental health impacts of abortion, you might imagine that people could experience regret at having decided to have an abortion, perhaps relief at being able to have an abortion. Maybe they experience depression or anxiety or symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Here's what the data say from the Turnaway study. So women who seek and receive an abortion compared to those who seek and are turned away from having an abortion are not more depressed or more anxious. They do not have higher levels of depression or anxiety, either immediately after receiving an abortion or 5 years later. They are not more likely to have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They are not more likely to experience suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide. And in fact, the most common emotion experienced among women who receive an abortion is relief. And 99% of women who received an abortion in the Turnaway study report that it was the right decision for them 5 years later. So all this suggests that abortion does not have a negative impact on mental health for those who seek and receive them. Next, turning to economic outcomes, let's take a look at this graph here. So pay attention to the difference between the green line here. These are the folks who in the study were seeking an abortion and were turned away or denied. And the blue line is the people who were near the gestational limit for receiving an abortion, but were able to get one. And what we have on the y-axis here is a financial distress index. So this is sort of an amalgamation of financial outcomes, including amount in collections, having subprime credit scores, amount of bills past due, and public records, including bankruptcy and eviction. And what we can see here is that folks who were turned away from having an abortion when they were seeking one have higher levels of financial distress immediately following and continuing for the 5 years after they were seeking that abortion but denied it, whereas those who were received an abortion have lower levels of financial distress. Next, turning to domestic violence, we know from data from the Turnaway study that seeking and being denied an abortion is related to higher exposure to physical violence from a male partner who was involved in the pregnancy. So women who sought but were unable to get an abortion are exposed to higher levels of physical violence from a male partner compared to those who sought an abortion and were able to receive one. So just to show you a graph from the paper that reported these results, the important line to pay attention to here is this solid line here. These are the individuals who were turned away from having an abortion. And as you can see, there's no change in their exposure to physical violence from a partner, whereas for all the other groups, including the people who sought an abortion near gestational limits and were able to receive one, we see a decline in physical violence exposure. And then finally, how does abortion impact the lives of children? So children who were born due to abortion denial versus people who sought an abortion, were able to get one but had a subsequent pregnancy, are significantly more likely to live in families that don't have enough money to meet their basic needs and in families who have lower incomes. They're also significantly more likely to experience poor maternal bonding. So children born because abortions were denied to women are significantly more likely to live in families that don't have enough money and experience poor maternal bonding. Children who were living at the time that their mother was seeking an abortion, but whose mothers were ultimately turned away, so unable to have that abortion that they wanted, are significantly more likely to live below the federal poverty level. And they also have significantly lower child development scores compared to those whose parents were able to receive an abortion. Okay, so some take-home messages in summary. People who have abortions do not suffer negative mental health consequences and overwhelmingly feel it was the right decision for them immediately after they received the abortion and up to 5 years later. People who have abortions have better economic futures. They experience less financial distress and have better credit, which is important for a variety of outcomes. Restricted access to abortion is related to increased exposure to physical domestic violence for women who are unable to get abortions. And abortion denial results in more children living in poverty or under conditions of financial distress, results in children with lower development, and is related to poor maternal bonding. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. Good evening. Thanks for staying with us. My name is Mara Bookbinder, and I am professor and vice chair of the Department of Social Medicine here at UNC and core faculty in the Center for Bioethics as well. I am trained as a medical anthropologist, but I also have postdoctoral training in bioethics as well. And I'm going to be speaking tonight about ethical perspectives on abortion. So I'm going to start just with some conceptual background. Medical ethics rests on 4 core principles that were identified by Tom Beecham and James Childress in their book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, that's now on its 8th printing. So autonomy, first of all, has 2 components. It is the capacity to make informed decisions, and then also the freedom to do so. Beneficence means that all choices for patients are made with the intent to do good. Non-maleficence is the opposite. It reflects a commitment not to harm patients. And finally, justice means that patients are treated fairly and equitably. So these principles provide the building blocks for ethical arguments, but they don't provide a blueprint. And that is because these principles can be marshaled on both sides of morally contested issues such as abortion. Now, autonomy is probably the most fundamental of the 4 principles. And respecting patient autonomy and medical decision-making means acknowledging that patients are in the best position to ensure that their choices are aligned with their values and goals. In the domain of abortion, patients' autonomous rights have historically been limited because of competing claims about the rights of the developing embryo or fetus. And with the Dobbs decision, patients' autonomy is severely restricted because patients in some states cannot choose an abortion at all, with limited exceptions in some cases. So I would say fundamentally, people with differing views on the ethics of abortion have different views about the relationship between the moral status of the embryo or the fetus on the one hand, and the moral status of the pregnant person as autonomous decision maker on the other hand. And these views, they also have different views on which set of values ought to take precedence in this situation. So the key point that I want to make tonight about the ethics of abortion is that there's 2 different frames for thinking about abortion ethics. And I think these frames lead to very different kinds of ethical questions. So the first is, I think, the dominant way of thinking about the ethics of abortion. And this is the question of, is abortion right or wrong? And underlying this question are different views about the moral status of embryos and fetuses relative to the moral status of pregnant people. And I think that this question can lead us into very polarized debates that are often very difficult to resolve. But I want to channel my colleague, Katie Watson, who is a lawyer and abortion ethics expert, and professor at Northwestern University, in raising, I think, a different frame for thinking about the ethics of abortion. So if we accept the view that we live in a pluralist society, and by that I mean one that supports diverse religious, political, and moral views on topics such as abortion, then we have to reckon with how these diverse stances will be supported by our political and legal structures. And I think acknowledging this leads to a different set of questions about abortion ethics. These are questions such as, what are the ethical implications of abortion policies and abortion restrictions, and what ethical challenges do they create? And I would say that the legal challenges introduced by the Dobbs decision have ethical implications for both clinicians and patients. And I want to tell you just briefly about what some of these are. So first of all, for clinicians, abortion restrictions can create conflicts between the professional duty to follow the law and the professional duty to provide ethical care. Following abortion laws may mean neglecting to uphold the autonomy of a patient who has decided that abortion is the best medical option. And it can also violate the medical ethics principle of beneficence, or to do good. For example, by preventing a clinician from helping a patient avoid an illegal abortion or an undesired pregnancy. It's worth underscoring that these ethical issues are not only at stake in abortion care. Some of the new state abortion restrictions in the wake of the Dobbs decision have threatened the provision of reproductive health care beyond elective abortion to include things like miscarriage management, ectopic pregnancies, in vitro fertilization, and the treatment of other serious medical issues that can arise during pregnancy, such as cancer. And I don't have time to talk about this in great depth, but I'm happy to address further in the Q&A. So I've talked a little bit about autonomy, beneficence, and non-maleficence. What about justice? There's strong evidence to suggest that post-Dobbs abortion restrictions will disproportionately impact historically marginalized communities, particularly low-income Black and Native populations. And we already heard from Dr. Curtis that these are the populations that are overrepresented among people who get abortions in the US. And they're also likely to be disproportionately affected by new abortion restrictions because they're less likely to be able to travel to access abortion. So abortion restrictions are likely to exacerbate pre-existing health disparities. Now, this raises ethical concerns about justice because these restrictions will not impact pregnant people evenly. The anticipated impact on historically marginalized groups will be worse. And public health ethics suggests that public health policies that disproportionately harm historically marginalized groups without a counterbalancing benefit to them are unjust. So to sum up, I think that the ethics debate about whether abortion is right or wrong has to be understood within the broader context of the ethical questions and challenges that abortion restrictions may leave in their wake. And if our public policy decisions align with the view that abortion is wrong, we must also be prepared to address the ethical problems caused by those policies. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. All right. Without further ado, we will share the QR code again. So if you are doing one of the if you're here joining us as part of the Continuing Life Experiences course, thank you for being with us today. And here's the QR code. I'll leave this up for just one more minute and then I'll get started. Okay, last chance for Continuing Life Experiences credit code. Okay. So today I am a sociologist and I want us to think about what I think you should know about searching for an abortion. So all the other very brilliant researchers and scholars on this panel have done an extremely good job of telling you about what it actually means to have an abortion. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit more about the technical side.
My name is Francesca Bola-Tripodi. I am an assistant professor at the School of Information and Library Science and a senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And broadly speaking, my research thinks about how our inputs or our keywords shape the way that returns are returned to us. So search is definitely a ubiquitous part of everyday life. I know that many of people on this call have largely switched from a Googling it atmosphere to a TikToking it atmosphere. But because search has become so ubiquitous, we really don't think about the meaning behind what we search. And very rarely do we take time to really carve out our day with search. Often we're bombarded by lots of information, potentially false information, and very quickly we're turning to an app or browser of choice to help confirm whether that's true or not true. Now, overwhelmingly, most people are still going to Google. That being said, Google is not the only way that people are searching for information. But in a research study that I conducted just a few years ago, and this is still backed by Pew, Google is still the primary way that people search. What one of my respondents talked about, and I think this really sums up why search returns are so important, is that often when people are trying to find information, they will literally go to Google, read the first 3 or 5 returns, and often that information has been conveyed to us as more trustworthy or more accurate. So a lot of different research has demonstrated that what's referred to as SERP, or the way that returns are organized, helps give people a skewed understanding of importance. So what I'm here to talk about a little bit is why those top returns might not necessarily be the most trusted, especially when it's pertaining to health and access to an abortion. Now, the way information has ordered has dramatically shifted. And this is a screen graph from Bing, so it doesn't look like I'm picking on any one search return. But what you'll see is that what's shifted in information science, what we refer to as an exploratory practice to a fact retrieval practice. So you'll see this knowledge graph here at the top. You also see an over-reliance on sources like Wikipedia. And doing this allows search engines to really keep you on their platform for as long as possible. And it's not just Bing and Google doing this, DuckDuckGo is obviously doing this as well. And what I argue a lot and why I want to talk about with you all today is that this shift in information is not particularly concerning when you're searching for something that has only one answer. The one I give a lot is how many ounces are in a gallon. None of us know this necessarily off the top of our head, but it's a great way for us to go to search for that. The problem is much more of our search traffic is messier than that. And search engines are not designed to necessarily handle existential crises. The other big thing that people really don't understand is that the information you need is dependent on what you search and when. So there was a really great study that was conducted that looked at undergraduates' inability to access Plan B. And this was largely because they had no idea how to search for Plan B. So I'm really thankful that our other panelists today talked about the difference between the abortion pill and Plan B. Plan B is a great source that you'd want to get before you found out you were pregnant. But information seekers, in particular undergraduates, if they were searching for things like abortion pill, you're never going to get access to where you can find Plan B. So taking into account what you search and when. It's also important to pay attention to the fact that those summaries that are provided to us by search engines aren't necessarily always accurate. So in a live search study that I conducted this summer, I asked a very simple prompt about what would you do if a friend of yours came to you and they found out they were pregnant unexpectedly and wanting to terminate the pregnancy. And what I was trying to do was figure out, well, how people think about the topic dramatically changes the kinds of search terms that they start with, and that those search terms that they start with will veer them in a lot of different directions. But something else that I found that was quite unexpected was early on, and this has been changed or modified since July, but in July and August, when people were searching abortion near me, they weren't actually always getting clinics that provided abortions. They were also getting advertising that was potentially swaying people away from abortions. They were getting information about Planned Parenthoods that were closest to them, but didn't actually provide abortions. And so the number one thing that I'd love to convey to you is that when it comes to health, please do more than just read the summaries and read the closest, right? Actually click on those links, take a little bit of time, and make sure that the information that you're trying to access actually meets what you need. The other really important thing that I want us to just briefly cover is surveillance. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about why what you're doing online matters, especially in a politically changing landscape, right? So HIPAA is really good about protecting your privacy when you talk to a doctor. HIPAA does not protect when you're looking at third-party apps. And this is problematic because many of the apps that you get through Google Store or Apple Play, these apps actually sell your data to other third parties. So knowing and understanding the privacy surrounding the apps you download is really important. The other thing that's really important is that governments and law enforcement can subpoena companies for data on their users. And that evidence that they can use against you can include your online search history, your social media posts, as well as access to messaging services. This can be particularly problematic because we often think about a messaging app as a really private space. I think many of us, or especially younger students that are on here as part of their college education, the idea of don't post things to social media has really been drilled into us. But I think there's less discussion around what we search for can also be used against us. And also those messaging apps, right? WhatsApp, Slack. Slack is really big in many corporate environments, but these are archived and they're not encrypted. And the last thing that I just wanted to sort of touch on is that data brokers are already doing this. So we know that data brokers were selling the location information of people who used credit cards, for example, when accessing abortion services. We also know that cell phones can be used to geolocate and identify where people are at any given moment. So part of this could happen depending on if laws change and how they can subpoena your records. Part of this is already happening, and I'm happy to talk about this at all in Q&A. The last thing that I just want to sort of touch on is that sometimes people think that they are circumventing this when it comes to anonymous mode or private modes. And so there are some period tracker apps that a lot of young people use when trying to, just make sure they're tracking their period. Right now, these apps like Flow Health and Q, they claim to keep data safe and private, but they do also acknowledge that data sharing exists and it happens when it comes to processing your data. So it is still kind of unclear about how that might relate to any kind of legislation that could be used against you in the court of law. Many people have heard about incognito mode. I think it's really important to understand incognito mode might temporarily influence the kind of personalized results that you get, but it doesn't actually hide your browsing history. DuckDuckGo is a way that you can prevent consistent personalization or profile patterns, but DuckDuckGo doesn't mean you can't still be tracked, right? So if you search for something on DuckDuckGo and then you visit the website, the websites that you visit likely have cookies enabled that allow for tracking and personalization. Also, internet service providers, which is ISPs, can still gather the kind of searches that you conduct on DuckDuckGo, even though it's not necessarily using it for commercial reasons. It is still storing that data. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have about surveillance or searching. The last thing I'll leave you with is that often people say, well, I go to DuckDuckGo, and so I don't have to worry about my inputs. But I would say it's extremely important that no matter what browser you're using, you pay an awful lot of attention to how your starting points can lead you into rabbit holes of potentially harmful disinformation, specifically as it pertains to your health. Okay, so that's all. I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you so much to our panelists for really an extraordinary amount of information that covers many different aspects of abortion in our culture today. We have a number of good questions, so here they go. I would first pose to Mara Bookbinder a question that someone from the audience has put into our Q&A. What is your biggest concern about abortion in the state of North Carolina as an ethicist?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I would probably say that it has to do with those issues around access that I alluded to in my presentation. Abortion is legal in North Carolina. It is somewhat precarious, but because we are adjacent to many southern states with much more severe restrictions, there are many, what my colleague is calling abortion refugees that are coming into North Carolina seeking abortion. And that is putting a real strain on the abortion workforce. And it's also, affecting the ability of people who live in North Carolina to get abortion in a timely manner. So I would say that that is a big concern. There was a second portion of that question that maybe I can address briefly about ethicists being in the position of deciding who gets abortion. And I just wanted to speak about that, but because I think the reason why, and you may have seen stories covering this in the news, but the reason why it seems like ethicists are sometimes now being in the position of, I am in my UNC office and they're trying to come vacuum. Excuse me, can you come back later? Thank you. Sorry about that. So the reason why ethicists, why it seems that ethicists may be making decisions about who gets an abortion is because often these laws are not written in a very clear and easy to interpret way. And so when hospitals are unclear about what counts as an emergency, because some of the exceptions that are made are when the patient's life is in danger, it is sometimes being turned over to ethics committees to help them decide, what constitutes an emergency and is this warranted? And so I don't think that ethicists should be in that position, but that is unfortunately what is happening given the legal climate that we're in.
Thank you. Dr. Rebecca Kreitzer, here's the question for you, and it's quite simple. Given what everyone has talked about today, why is it that abortion is so regulated?
For being a simple question, it really doesn't have a simple answer. I think there's a lot of things that contribute to why we have the abortion policy climate that we have today. One part of it has to do with misinformation. Excuse me, pardon me. A lot of people in the last week were surprised by an article in The Guardian that went viral, and TikTok that also went viral, that showed the gestational period of different pregnancies that Dr. Bryant showed as well in her presentation. There's evidence that suggests that when people have misinformation about abortion corrected, it changes how they think about abortion. So we're in a quandary because actually for a long time, abortion and discussions about abortion and pregnancy loss and miscarriage have been fairly stigmatized. And so a lot of people haven't had those conversations, don't even know that they themselves had maybe even had an abortion or people that they know. And so this misinformation causes people to think a certain way about abortion and abortion seekers and why they're seeking abortion. So in addition to misinformation, I think another important part is politics. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that abortion has been a very mobilizing policy issue for political parties, both parties really, but maybe especially the Republican Party, mobilized initially by the rise of the evangelical movement of the moral majority in the 1980s. I think other people would also answer the question by saying that society has has felt comfortable making policies that restrict women's autonomy and take a feminist lens in critiquing policies that have paternalistic oversight over people's bodies. So I think that the answer to this is really multifaceted, and it builds on things that include misinformation, politics, and also just how society has understood these issues over time.
Thank you. We have another question, perhaps Dr. Amy Bryant. This could be a good one for you to address. It's on the long side, but let me try to synopsize it. So this questioner says they have a hard time thinking abortion is justified if it presents only convenience and not medical harm. However, in recognition of a lot of the data that's been presented, and abortion as a public health issue, this questioner wonders, can you be ethically against the idea of abortion? And can you also vote pro-choice because of the empirical data? That's one part of the question.
I think to answer the first part of the question, which was about, say it one more time.
There's concern about abortion.
About the abortion of convenience, right? So, you know, in my experience providing abortion care, I have to say that I just have never experienced someone coming in for an abortion out of convenience. I think this is kind of a myth or a trope that's out there that, you know, someone might get an abortion on her lunch hour or something, and that it's not something that people think about or take seriously. And that's just not the way it is. I mean, as with many different medical decisions that people make, this is something that people make out of a very a real consideration of their own life situation and circumstances. And often it's people who already have children making this in the interest of their other children and things like that. So I think that that's just, you know, I think that's one of the myths that needs to be expelled, is that abortions aren't done out of convenience. And then to answer the other part of the question about the whether you can ethically, yes, you know, disagree with abortion and be pro-choice, I think absolutely you can. I mean, there are many things that that someone might not agree with, but not want to be outlawed. So think, for example, a Jehovah's Witness. Jehovah's Witnesses don't want to accept blood products or, you know, or blood transfusions, things like that. Yet I don't think that there's not a large movement trying to ban blood products from being available in hospitals. And I think no one is forced to have an abortion, and this is a decision that people make after conferring with their families and their doctors about what the best course of action is for them. And so I think it is perfectly consistent to feel that you personally would not want to have an abortion or would not feel comfortable with that, but that you think that it should be something that's available for other people to have.
And this may be a short follow-up. The question is, this questioner is pro contraception, and she's wondering, or they are wondering, whether separating contraception and the issues surrounding contraception from issues surrounding abortion might be a good, it sounds like almost a strategic way to go for people or a movement that's pro-choice.
Well, I think that contraception is absolutely an important preventive measure to keep people from having pregnancies they don't want to have. On the other hand, about 50% of pregnancies that end in abortion are conceived when contraception was being used. So contraception is simply not a fail-proof way to prevent pregnancy. If you think about it, a person of reproductive age has about 30 years of trying to prevent pregnancy in their lifetime. And one or two times someone might become pregnant when they're not planning to. Contraception doesn't always work. And so I think that while it is an extremely important tool in our armamentarium to keep people from getting pregnant, it's not the only answer. And then there are also pregnancies that are going to go wrong. So there are pregnancies that have abnormalities, there are pregnancies that have, people that develop medical problems during their pregnancy that necessitate an abortion. And so there are lots of reasons why abortion can't be entirely set aside, and it needs to be available and safe and legal.
Thanks so much.
It's part of healthcare.
Dr. Sean Curtis, this one is, I think, for you. Is it known whether the increase in abortions that occurred in 2020 is related to abortions becoming increasingly accessible for people of color and marginalized populations? Or did these populations still have similar levels of access as prior to 2020?
Thanks. So I think that there's still active research going on as to better understand why abortion increased up. I mean, if anything, abortion access was likely to be a little bit more difficult in 2020 because of just the pandemic making access to health services generally more difficult, and some states deciding that abortion was not essential healthcare and therefore not allowed to stay open and so forth. So there were a number of reasons where access may not actually have been improved, may actually have been deteriorated. I think, some of the drivers, if you think about what drives abortion, there are things like how likely people are to have an unplanned pregnancy, and if they do have an unplanned pregnancy, how they decide to resolve that, whether they decide to continue the pregnancy or end the pregnancy. And one thing we've seen in 2020 is that the birth rate overall went down by a similar amount as well. So it may well be that with the uncertainty of the pandemic and people's the whole situation around that people felt this was not a good time to have children. So they were more likely to have less likely to have a live birth, and then one way they achieve that is by being more likely to have an abortion.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat, which perhaps you could take, Dr. Rebecca Kreitzer. The question has to do with, what is your advice for talking about abortion to others? In my case, I'm teaching an undergraduate course on poverty, and I've added a unit on contraception and abortion. But I think this question can apply more generally to people who want to open up conversations about abortions with their friends and family.
This is such a great and important question. And my answer from this is drawn from the literature in political science and political psychology on communication and persuasion. I think one of the problems in talking about contentious policy or political issues is that people sometimes are afraid to have the conversations in the first place. And that second, people become initially defensive of their positions before taking the time to truly listen to the other side. So in the case of abortion, it's definitely the case that at first glance, a lot of people think that abortion is an easy issue. In fact, there's a whole literature in political science about easy issues, and they call abortion an easy issue. But actually, it's quite a complicated issue. And when you talk to people, even people who identify as pro-life, they tend to have complicated views, and that their views are not as black and white as people perceive them to be right away. One good way to help people navigate this is by talking through different scenarios that can help you find common ground. So for example, you might talk about how the fact is that there's a lot of misinformation about a certain issue, or you might talk about how there's really not very many people who are seeking third trimester abortions, for example, which don't really exist as a thing. And what you'll find is that there's really not very many people who think that there should be no exceptions to abortion at all. And there really aren't that many people who say that there should be absolutely zero regulation of abortion at all either. And I think it's important to acknowledge that on both sides, because it leads for room for people to talk about the places in which we overlap. Another way that you can talk about it is by kind of working through some of those complications. So what about the fact that in the US, childbirth is very expensive, especially if you don't have insurance. And if you're a person of color in certain states where the maternal mortality is sometimes like many times higher than it is for white people, Well, what do you think about the fact that some people can't afford to obtain an abortion? Would you support the idea that people who are experiencing poverty should be able to get funds to help them? And sometimes talking through scenarios like that can help you find spaces where maybe you'll identify places that you disagree on, but you might also find places that you agree on, and you might also help to combat some misinformation. The final thing I'll say about it is that it's just really important to emphasize coming into it with an open mind and to truly listen to people on the other side. So often people will just kind of emotionally respond without carefully listening to each other. And when we don't feel validated in explaining our opinions to other people, it can just perpetuate this division, and it makes us even less likely to listen to other people as well. So I really encourage people to have conversations and to try to break down the stigmas of some of these things. And it might mean that you are feeling a little bit uncomfortable in the process, but as long as you're empathetic and open-minded, I really think that it can be for the better.
Thanks so much. I know some of my students have wondered about the question I'm about to ask. This is from someone who sent in the question, and I think it's for Dr. Amy Bryant. Could you address the actual size of fetuses at different lengths of gestation, for instance, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, and 14 weeks? I was infuriated by the huge images the people on the quad, UNC's quad displayed recently, which were quite bloody, very large, and this person writes, grossly inaccurate.
So to answer the question about the size of various fetuses, and at the most common gestational ages where people have abortions, I showed some of those pictures in my slides. And let me see, I could try to show it to you again here. Let me share this real quick. So you can see, this is a picture of a pregnancy. This is the entire pregnancy at 5 weeks of pregnancy. So it's about, I'm gonna say 4 or 5 millimeters. At 6 weeks, it's about 1 centimeter or so, about the size of a dime. At 7 weeks, it's a little bit bigger, about 1.5 centimeters, maybe the size of a quarter. At 8 weeks, a little bit bigger. At 9 weeks, it's about the size of a little bigger than like $0.50. So, and this is the whole pregnancy. You can't actually see a fetus yet at this stage of the pregnancy. It's just too early. By about 10 weeks, the fetus would be about just over 1 inch long, very tiny. And then at 14 weeks, I should think she asked, it's about 3.5 inches long. And fetuses continue to develop, as I showed. So every week they do get a little bigger. And so you can see more parts as you go further. I would say that, I've seen those types of pictures up before. And I think that they're very sensational and show a minority of what real abortion care looks like in terms of what fetal parts look like and such. And they're not representative of the vast majority of abortions that occur.
Thanks so much. I recognize we have 3 more minutes, and we have 2 more questions that have come to us just recently. Francesca Tripodi, perhaps these are for you. I'll read both and we'll see if we can address them. Number 1, given the misinformation aspect on abortion, how are crisis pregnancy centers perpetuating this? And how can misinformation on abortion be addressed through policy and/or programs, in your opinion? So that's 1. And number 2, what are good resources for finding more information on abortion and statistics surrounding abortion?
So I'll punt number 2 to the experts on this panel who have a much better idea of where to go for really good information. Regarding CPCs, I think this is a huge thing that was recently shifted in how people find information. So up and until July and August this year, the top return for abortion near me was in fact CPCs. And that's because they drive a lot of the advertising revenue. The decision to change that was one at the industry. And so what's concerning is that there is very little policy or regulation around controlling misinfo because of freedom of speech. And content moderation is a very sticky info question. I teach a whole class on this, so if you want to come talk to me, happy to talk more about misinfo. But CPCs in particular do a lot of the advertising, and advertising dominates search returns. One last thing that I think relates to everybody is keywords that were created specifically to spread disinfo. So some of them were even addressed, right? The fact that we had a whole presentation on why post-abortion stress syndrome isn't real is because there was a very active campaign to claim that it was real. The fact that we have the phrases late-term abortion, those were created specifically to spread disinfo. And so I think it's important to recognize the role language plays in perpetuating these problems, as well as images.
Well, I must say, as an English professor, I appreciate what you just said about language mattering. I recognize it's now 7 o'clock. It looks like Melody has put a few resources in the chat for people who want further information. I also, in closing, I want to thank the women on this panel for coming out this evening, for bringing their expertise. I want to thank the audience for asking such fabulous questions. This should be a beginning conversation and not by any means the end. And I think I am correct. Each of our panelists is an educator. And if you have questions that you would like to be in touch with the panel about, please look up their email addresses on the UNC website, and I'm sure they would be happy to pass along more information and more wisdom. Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Night.